All right, folks, welcome back. We are going to take a look now at some non-zero-sum games. Our focus so far has been on zero-sum games, in fact, on pretty simple zero-sum games, two-player zero-sum games, and in fact, even simpler than that, 2x2 zero-sum games. But not all games are so simple. Things are no longer so clean when we move to non-zero-sum games. That is, games where cooperation might pay off, where the Nash Equilibria will not have the same payoff values. The coordination theorem does not hold for non-zero-sum games. The equilibrium of these games lack these nice properties that strictly competitive games display for us. And because of this, these games are much more difficult to solve. They present novel problems for game theorists that we lack the mathematically rigorous solutions for that we have for strictly competitive games. So we're going to take a look over the next couple of weeks at some features of these non-zero-sum games. Let's start with an example. This is one we've seen before. It comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The example is Stag Hunt. You and an acquaintance have gone hunting, and you must each decide whether to pursue a large stag or to pursue a small hare. Alone, you can each capture a hare. However, a stag requires two people to capture it. If you cooperate and both hunt stag, then you'll end up with much meat. But if you hunt stag while your acquaintance hunts hare, then you return home empty-handed. Should you hunt stag or should you hunt hare? Should you guarantee yourself some meat or should you bet that the other player will cooperate with you? Well, what are the Nash Equilibria of Stag Hunt? This is a nice way of representing the game here in a matrix. Can we find any Nash Equilibria? In fact, there are two Nash Equilibria to Stag Hunt. 2-2 and 1-1 are both Nash Equilibria. Hunt stag, hunt hare. At hunt stag, neither player can unilaterally deviate and make themselves better off, so neither is incentivized to do so. Player 1, if player 2 is hunting stag, can't do better by hunting hare. And player 2, if player 1 is hunting stag, can't do better by hunting hare. And the same goes for hunt hare. And this is what makes the game tricky. If player 1 thinks player 2 is going to hunt hare, then player 1 can't do any better than also hunting hare. If they try to hunt stag, they go home empty-handed. If player 2 believes player 1 is going to hunt hare, then they can't do any better than also hunting hare. If they hunt stag, they go home empty-handed. So we've got two Nash Equilibria. But not both of them are optimal. If we think about maxi-minimizers in Stag Hunt, we'll see that the maxi-minimizer strategy will end up with both players hunting hare, because the min for stag for player 1 is 0, and the min for hare is 1. The maxi-minimizer is 1, and the same goes for call for player 2. So maxi-minimizers will result in a suboptimal Nash Equilibrium, hunt hare. Individual rationality alone cannot lead to the optimal Nash Equilibrium of hunt stag. It may be useful, then, to develop incentive mechanisms for cooperation, some way of getting us to that cooperative outcome, some kind of incentive for doing so. This is something to keep in mind. A second moral: not all Nash Equilibria of non-zero-sum games have the same utilities, so we can't speak of the value of a game for non-zero-sum games. And one more point that comes out from Stag Hunt: we can introduce a new concept here, the concept of Pareto Optimality or Pareto efficiency. In economics and decision theory, a Pareto optimal outcome is one such that no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. It's often taken as a kind of baseline for rational outcomes in games. So what's the Pareto optimal outcome of Stag Hunt? Pareto optimal outcome of Stag Hunt is hunt stag, hunt stag. It's the point in the game where no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. At hunt hare, 1-1, both players can be made better off without making the other worse off. So it is not Pareto optimal. It's Pareto suboptimal. Let's look at another game. We'll call this one Bach or Stravinsky. This is from Osborn and Rubenstein. Two people wish to go out together to a concert of music by either Bach or Stravinsky. Their main concern is to go to the concert together, but one person prefers Bach and the other person prefers Stravinsky. Suppose they have expressed their wishes to one another, they've talked about it, but have not been able to coordinate an outcome. No decision was reached. Maybe one of their phone batteries died. They have no way of getting in touch with each other now, but they hope to coordinate their behavior with one another. What should they do? This is a variant on a classic game called Battle of the Sexes. It's also sometimes called Clash of Wills, and in our homework we'll see examples of some of these. So here's Bach and Stravinsky Bach or Stravinsky in a game matrix. This time we see that Bach is the preferred outcome for player 1. And player 2 would prefer Stravinsky, where they both go to see Stravinsky. Player 2 will feel a little bit happier about that outcome because player 2 prefers Stravinsky. If player 1 went to Bach and player 2 went to Stravinsky, they'd both at least get to see a concert they'd enjoyed, but they did it alone and not with each other, and they prefer to be together. And if player 2 goes to Stravinsky or player 1 goes to Stravinsky to try to appease player 2, and player 2 goes to Bach to try to appease player 1, and they end up not linking up, then both of them, see concerts that they don't want to see, and they do it alone. What are the Nash Equilibria here? Here, they're Bach, Stravinsky. At Bach, neither player can unilaterally deviate and make themselves better off. Player 1 can't do any better by going to Stravinsky, only do much worse. And player 2 can't do any better by unilaterally switching to Stravinsky. They do a little bit worse. And the same is true at Stravinsky. So what's the moral? Again, playing maxi-minimizers will result in the non-equilibrium Bach-Stravinsky. Individual rationality leads to an unstable solution. Their maxi-minimizers would entail them each going to the concert that they would at least enjoy seeing, even if they end up there alone. And so they'll end up not linking up. They'll end up each going to a concert alone. But that's not what either of them wants. Alternative. What if each player, assuming the other is rational, thinks that the other will make the decision that she would make in the other's shoes? Would they be able to coordinate then? Think about that one. Another example, hawk and dove, from Osborn and Rubenstein. Again, this is a variant on chicken, which we saw in our previous homework. Two animals are fighting over some prey. Each can behave like a dove or like a hawk. The best outcome for each animal is that in which it acts like a hawk while the other acts like a dove. The worst outcome is that in which both animals act like hawks. Each animal prefers to be hawkish if its opponent is dovish, and dovish if its opponent is hawkish. So we see this payoff matrix. Dove is 2-2, hawk is 0-0. That's the game of chicken where they actually have the accident, and nobody wants that outcome. And dove hawk and Hawk-Dove are the preferred outcomes for each. Hawk-Dove is the preferred outcome for player 1, and Dove-Hawk is the preferred outcome for player 2. So what are the Nash Equilibria? Well, they're Hawk-Dove and Dove-Hawk. At Hawk-Dove, neither player can unilaterally deviate and make themselves better off, and the same is true at Dove-Hawk. But playing maxi-minimizers once again results in the non-equilibrium Dove-Dove. We didn't even end up in an equilibrium strategy by playing maxi-minimizers. Maxi-minimizers aren't actually a good guide in non-zero-sum games. Individual rationality, doing that which maximizes the minimum that one's going to receive in this case, is leading to an unstable solution to this game. Dove-Dove is not where we want to be. In fact, both players have some incentive to deviate. Either would prefer Hawk in this case. Now let's turn to a classic. Prisoner's Dilemma. Two individuals are known to have committed minor offenses, but they're also suspected of robbing a bank together. They're arrested and placed in separate interrogation rooms. If they both confess to the robbery, then they will be sentenced to 5 years in prison. If only one confesses, then he will be set free, but used as a character witness against the other individual, who will receive a sentence of 10 years. If neither confesses, then they will both be convicted of the minor offenses and sentenced only to 1 year in prison. Now, Prisoner's Dilemma is a one-off. This is happening one time only. So where do we want to end up? Well, the optimal outcome would be the outcome at which neither prisoner, neither player, confesses. They each get a year and then go on their way. But notice that that is not an equilibrium outcome. Notice that it's an unstable outcome, because if player 1 knows that player 2 isn't going to confess, then they have an incentive to confess and to turn on player 1, because they can get the better outcome of not going to jail at all. Similarly, for player 2, if player 2 knows that player 1's not going to confess, then they have some incentive to deviate and confess, and play, and confess and get no prison time, sending player 1 to prison for 10 years. So the optimal outcome, the outcome that seems best to us intuitively, is not in fact a Nash equilibrium. What are the Nash equilibria of this game? Are there any? In fact, there's one. Confess, confess. In this scenario, if you think that, if you're player 1 and you think that player 2 is going to confess, you can't do any better than also confessing. Because if you deviate and don't confess, you end up with 10 years in prison. And the same goes for player 2. So confess, confess, the outcome where you both get 5 years in prison, is the only Nash equilibrium outcome. But it's clearly not the outcome that you'd prefer to end up in. We'll look at what happens next week when we iterate the Prisoner's Dilemma, when we allow it to be played over a series of of instances rather than just as a one-off game. And it changes the logic of the game dramatically when we iterate it in that way. But for now, let's focus our attention on the one-off prisoner's dilemma, where the Nash Equilibrium is a suboptimal outcome. It's not the outcome that anybody really wants. There are a bunch of cases in real life where prisoner's dilemmas arise, a bunch of real-life cases where we have to deal with this problem. And so it's a really important problem to try to understand. Unfortunately, it's not one that has a straightforward solution. It's not clear what the optimal strategy is. Some examples of real-life prisoner's dilemma are things like arm races. Mutually assured destruction is an example of the prisoner's dilemma. It would be best if everyone got rid of their nukes. But if you think that the other player is going to get rid of their nukes, then you do better off by stockpiling yours. And they're in the same boat. So everyone just ends up stockpiling more and more nuclear weapons. Vampire bats are an interesting natural example of real-life prisoners' dilemmas. Vampire bats drink blood. They bring their blood meals home to their roosts, and they share them with non-relative bats, non-blood relative bats, and this, if we think about it from an evolutionary perspective, is a kind of prisoner's dilemma that they seem to have solved, because they are reaching the optimal outcome where everyone shares, instead of ending up in the suboptimal outcome where everyone hoards their own, or keeps their own, which is what prisoner's dilemma implies they should do. So vampire bats seem to have a solution. Doping in sports is a real-life prisoner's dilemma. It would be better if nobody did it, but since you think that the others are going to do it, you've got to do it too. Drug addiction is interestingly modeled as a real-life prisoner's dilemma. This is modeled through time, so temporally. If we think of the game between present self and future self, then we can think of drug addiction as a kind of prisoner's dilemma. The best outcome, the optimal outcome for both present self and future self is the outcome where neither present self nor future self gets high. But present self doesn't trust that future self will not get high, even if present self refrains from doing so, because present self believes future self, having refrained for so long, will decide, well, it's worth it this one time to go ahead and get high, and so future self will deviate and not hold up that unstable non-equilibrium strategy, and as a result, present self says, well, I might as well get high too. And we end up in the suboptimal but Nash Equilibrium strategy of continuing this addictive behavior. And CO2 emissions, or reductions in CO2 emissions, are also a real-life prisoner's dilemma. It would be best if everyone reduced their emissions, but if one country believes that another country or the other country is going to reduce their emissions, then it is in their interest to continue emitting because they can secure the benefits of other countries reducing emissions while themselves avoiding the harms and the harms of reduction in terms of its economic cost. So it's a real-life prisoner's dilemma. I'm going to skip the prisoner's dilemma as a Newcomb problem and look at one final example. This is called the traveler's dilemma. An airline loses your suitcase and the suitcase of your doppelganger that has the exact same contents. An airline manager separates you and your doppelganger and asks you both to estimate the value of your lost luggage at no less than $2 and no more than $100, which is the maximum that the airline will reimburse you. If you both write down the same number, then the manager will treat this as the true value of your luggage and reimburse you both this amount. But if you write down different numbers, then the manager will treat the lower number as the true value. Moreover, whichever one of you wrote down the lower number will be awarded $2 extra for your honesty, and whichever one of you wrote down the higher number will have $2 deducted from your payout. What number do you write down? Well, the matrix looks something like this. What's the Nash equilibrium here? It turns out that it's 2, 2. This is a tricky game that the airline can play, because if you write down, say, if you're player 1 and you're thinking about writing down $5 because you think that's the value of your luggage, and player 2 is going to write down $5, you think that player 2 is going to write down $5 because you think that that's the value of the luggage, then you have an incentive to write down $4 because you can get an extra couple of bucks out of it, or an extra buck out of it, at player 2's expense. But if player 2 is thinking the same thing, then they're going to write down $4, and you know that, so you'd best write down $3. But if player 2 is thinking the same thing, they're going to write down $3, and you know that, so you'd best write down $2 so that you can get the 4. But player 2 knows that you're going to do that, so they're also going to write down $2. And we've worked our way back to the Nash equilibrium of $2, $2. And note that this top region of the game is just the prisoner's dilemma. Top left region of the game is just the prisoner's dilemma. It's the same payoff structure. So prisoner's dilemma is an interesting, complicated, and kind of fun problem that's going to be with us over the next week or so. We're going to look at what happens when we iterate it. We're going to talk about some ways in which prisoner's dilemma and Stag Hunt have played a role in evolutionary theory, and we're going to, in a couple of weeks, look at how prisoner's dilemma and Stag Hunt and other games of this flavor might help us to understand how altruistic behavior evolved and how our practices of morality evolved. So something to look forward to. But that's all for now.